Hi, my name is Connor Engel, here with a topic analysis for DebateDrills. Today we're going to be talking about the general negative positions on this topic that can be labeled as critiques. This topic analysis will contain a discussion of Afropessimism, the Foucault critique, as well as the Capitalism critique. Each one will contain a general thesis explanation of the critique, as well as a brief explanation of the specific links as applies to this topic. Resolved, in the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. So to begin with, what parts of the university are relevant to the discussion of critiques? Well, in order to understand this, we sort of have to take the general pessimistic outlook on education that begins, most formally, with Bryan Caplan's The Case Against Education. In it, he argues of education as a general structure or system that is meant mostly for meritocratic signaling, which is to say, not for the value of education itself, but for rather the social value that a diploma brings you in a modern-day society, which is to say, it affirms that you have some relevant level of education. It affirms that you have some way of paying for college, and generally implies that you have the perseverance and wherewithal to maintain the workload that college requires. College is also characterized generally by a system of indoctrination by which you are taught certain beliefs, just like every other school. So why do we generally believe that education is valuable? Well, we know that it has financial incentive. Most people end up getting college diplomas by virtue of the fact that they want to have higher paying jobs, which would require a college degree. There's a general hope for reform in college where even if there's a sense that colleges are unfair or biased against minorities or people of low income, that there is potential hope to make the system better. There's also just general social and pressure and a certain social convention to join college or to go to college, depending on where you grow up, depending on where you live, who you surround yourselves with. Many people will end up going off to college, and it'll be seen as something that you might be encouraged to do, potentially by your parents or your peers. And this brings us finally to which people are excluded from higher education. Which people will the critiques most likely be talking about? Generally, this is referring to, most broadly, people who are not wealthy, which is to say people who cannot easily afford college or who may not have had the requisite education with which to know that college was important, and then racial and other gendered minorities, being the people that may have more difficulty statistically making it into certain colleges, especially given things like standardized entrance exams, as well as people who may feel excluded on college campuses given the type of academic subjects discussed there or the general college environment in certain areas. So to begin with, what positions are these Ks generally going to be applicable to? So first off, soft left AFs that defend institutional reform and given alternatives to standardized testing are always going to be a target for these more generic, sort of broad Ks that attack the system of education in general, perhaps the ideology of meritocracy, or even the entire structure of the state. Right? Generally, any affirmatives that institute some sort of reform or in any way view the academic system or the state as being redeemable will be the target of critiques which abolish or somehow condemn the system writ large. This, of course, goes even more for AFs that defend the educational system, more so than just say it should be reformed. These would be affirmatives that indicate that a system of meritocracy by which we find the most intelligent people through an educational system is good. Oftentimes, these AFs would include links that universities are key to establishing some sort of economic prosperity because it trains people to be better workers or more informed constituents. Perhaps it solves warming or military readiness because it gets people more involved in the general civic system, meaning they might be encouraged to join the army through some sort of ROTC program, or just generally encouraged to be part of the general civic democratic populace, which might be key to establishing some sort of push against the anti-environmentalism that is currently happening within our government structure, and just generally encouraging people to be more part of the government. It has an internal link to any number of democracy good impacts. So to begin with, let's talk about Afropessimism. The Afropessimism critique is a generally generic critique that has existed in pretty much every topic since its founding. It begins with the principal discussion of ontology, also known as the study of being. What this means is it discusses what does it mean to be black, what does it mean to experience black life. We won't talk at length about all the general justifications here, but we'll generally give you a summary of each of the main concepts of Afropessimism. The first being social death. This discusses the black subject versus the general human subject. What that means is Afropessimist theorists, notably people like Orlando Patterson or Frank B. Wilderson, would suggest that the black subject is set as the antithesis, otherwise known as the complete opposite of, the human subject, instead of it being perceived as a simple nature of black versus white, which is to say slave versus slave master in this metaphor. It is instead positioned as black versus human, in which black is characterized as the inhuman, the sort of object as opposed to human, the thing that occupies no category of humanity, but rather only the category of blackness. This would generally indicate that black people are not capable of potentially viewing the world in the same way in which others are, because they constantly view it through a lens of embedded slavery, dishonor, and general gratuitous violence. In addition, they don't benefit from the same general things that other humans would, right? The same rights don't apply to them as they would normally. The same general interpersonal interactions don't apply to them as they would normally, because people often view blacks, particularly white people, view blacks as sort of a subject of fear, derision, criminality that needs to be suppressed or gotten rid of. This also leads into a sort of discussion of political death, in which the black subject is always criminalized or harmed by the sort of general operation of the state, also known as civil society. This is to say that inside civil society, particularly the United States, which Afropessimism is specific to, the black subject is never given the same rights as the white subject, or perhaps even other minority subjects. It is constantly seen under the law as a body or an object to be exploited or to be taken advantage of, or otherwise to control using tactics like over-policing or constant criminal regulation, which traps black people inside the prison industrial complex. This constructs the black subject as fungible, or in other words, being able to be used for anything in the eyes of the law or for the legal system. And it forwards a general narrative of no progress, which is to say, given the way in which the United States is built, on the backs of slaves, using the infrastructure of slavery, and the general requirement of black death, just like in contemporary society in which large police forces are justified via the fact that they need to regulate ghettos and general minority neighborhoods, where the prisons are built in order to keep up with the demand for incarceration of minorities. The belief is that there is simply no hope or no possibility of reform within a system in which black subjects are socially dead, and a government that views them as being politically dead or sort of not worthy of political rights. But how would this link more specifically to the general resolution as it is now? Well, first, this would obviously target any attempt to reform the university system. Not only are public colleges and universities literally part of the government, but even private colleges and institutions are still embedded within the general system of civil society. Universities sort of monopolize a control over particular knowledge, oftentimes valorizing white knowledge like particular Western continental philosophy, or the belief that the United States is a just democratic system. It also contains some sort of control over careers, where black students are sort of funneled into specific majors in order to make a proper career in finance or economics or something, as opposed to going into Africana majors, or majors like civil studies, which might help them improve life for black people. They are sort of often told that those are not legitimate careers, and colleges tend to underfund those programs deliberately in order to incentivize, more engagement in STEM fields and movement away from fields that would benefit the black populace writ large. There's also a consideration of the historical injustice that takes place at colleges, where standardized testing particularly has been used in the past as a tool to bar minority students from participating in the educational system, and as a way to justify the general eugenic view of black people as being literally biologically inferior in terms of intellect and capability than white people or other possible minorities. There also needs to be brought up the sort of mention of campus policing as the third link, which is that there is still, a police presence on campus. And as such, in many public colleges and universities, the arm of the state extends to actual state violence, in which protesters or students on campuses are oftentimes persecuted, arrested, or even face physical violence at the hands of a system of over-policing which extends to the physical geography of the campus itself. All these things, as well as the general links, which would usually implicate the state writ large and the possibility of hope or reform within the state system would make the Afropessimism K very viable on this topic as it is on other topics. But I think that uniquely there exists the possibility to maybe even have more particular links, which would make it more specific to the resolution itself, whereas in other topics it generally tends to be a bit more generic. So I definitely think there is certain ground here. Next, we'll talk about the Capitalism K. The Capitalism K sort of functions on four general concepts, not all of which is sort of the general fundamental argument of the capitalism critique, but which we will discuss for the sake of this topic analysis. The first is this argument of base versus superstructure. The base refers to the actual technology and capacity of labor, which is to say, the physical way by which we perform our jobs, the actual tools one might use to perform one's work. This base, Marx believed, forms the superstructure of capitalism, which are essentially the cultural values and social values that combine to create and forge a capitalistic society. Karl Marx, as pictured to the right, of course, is the sort of progenitor of early Marxism and what we now sort of refer to broadly as anti-capitalism. The second process he identified in terms of understanding capitalism is historical materialism. In other words, the idea that all history is explainable via the diffusion of labor and capital, that all things throughout history follow a general bend of who is acquiring capital, who is using the power of this capital and exerting it over others, and generally marks the sort of divide between what we see as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which is to say the working class and the sort of wealthy elite aristocratic class, and the general tension between those two classes moving throughout history. This is usually referred to more broadly as class struggle. Thirdly, there is a sort of understanding of commodification. I think this is the most specific sort of concept that applies to this resolution, because it is the concept of the reduction of an external good to a market value. In other words, taking something that might usually have some particular value, let's say, the sentimental value that a particular piece of art you had or made as a child might have, and giving it a market value, which is to say, selling that piece of art takes away its sentimental value and instead replaces it with the $50 which you decided to sell it for, and therefore changes the way in which it is valued. This will be more clear when we talk about the way in which education is commodified in the current system. Finally, individualism is also very important to the general university system. It is a focus on the self that aids capitalistic belief. In other words, capitalism is always inherently resistant toward its counterpart, communism, which emphasizes communal struggle, general cooperation toward a creation of equality in which all people are alike. Capitalist individualism is the fundamental opposite of this, in which they argue that you ought to focus on the self, you ought to focus on getting ahead of others and being palpably better and more successful than all your peers and constantly comparing yourself to others in that competitive fashion. In addition, you want to resist any sort of temptation to ally together or mobilize with other workers, because you want to separate yourself and not have a sort of class consciousness in which all workers view themselves as similar. Rather, capitalism would want us to atomize ourselves from each other and view ourselves as individual workers that ought to get ahead independently in a capitalist system, and that other workers that are lagging behind or don't have as many rights shouldn't be concerned about because they simply aren't working as hard as we are and aren't going to be as successful as we are. To put it more specifically, universities are a fantastic link to the Capitalism K, and I think this is going to be a very solid generic on this topic. First of all, universities nowadays are generally profit-driven. There's a specific commodification of education in which universities, as we all know, are incredibly expensive. The reason being is that they are run like businesses in order to gain as many resources as possible, to constantly expand, build newer dining halls, dorms, all of which attempt to attract more students. But the general idea is not to provide more education, but rather to generate more revenue. As such, there are many classes that are put in or expanded upon that are specific revenue generators. Classes like business and economics majors, which we'll refer to in the next link, and STEM majors are generally expanded upon and given more resources than humanities majors, like the aforementioned Africana studies, by virtue of the fact that they know that most students will want to participate in these majors, as opposed to the more niche, perhaps more liberal majors that generally don't get as much attention. But this is a deliberate goal of the university, which again, its purpose is to maintain profit, where its purpose should normally be simply to teach children. This this changes the university's priorities, the way it is structured, the way its administrative policies are constructed, and generally the priorities which the university pursues. Secondarily, the idea is that universities literally train capitalists. The first is that it is a system of meritocratic propaganda. In other words, colleges tell you that you got in because you were the best, you tried the hardest, and you deserve to get in. In actuality, there are probably a litany of factors that allow you to get in, given different types of privilege, different connections, different geographic regions with which one comes from and applies to, and more than all, simply luck. A lot of the college process is sort of more of a lottery than we give into. However, colleges often tell us that we are unique and special in order to promote the sort of individualism which they know appeals to us. In addition, the idea being that colleges are once again grade-centered and focused. You are differentiated from your peers, not by your rights or your interests, but rather solely by who is able to perform better in a purely capitalistic sense. There is one standard for good performance, and that standard is GPA. As such, we are taught that the most valuable people, the most important people, are simply the people with the highest GPA. And this general meritocratic propaganda that these people ought to be also receiving the highest accolades and awards in our society are fundamental to a capitalist system. That is the way in which the capitalist system purports to be able to pick the best workers, done purely by meritocracy. In addition, there are literal majors that will indoctrinate you into the capitalist system. As portrayed on the right, the classic business and econ general finance majors are all created largely by the university system. Universities have massive industries that are all focused in terms of econ majors, finance majors, business majors. These are all to better promote a capitalist system and to train a generation of young people that will actively benefit and contribute to the growth of a capitalist system. Third, universities try and pacify revolutionary criticism. There is a well-known capitalistic author by the name of Slavoj Žižek, which often criticizes sort of leftists for making claims about capitalism, but making them in an empty fashion. For example, simply wearing a t-shirt that says capitalism is bad is by no means a particularly revolutionary criticism. This is not solely because you have paid for said t-shirt, but moreover because you have simply not done anything to change the status quo of capitalism, other than simply acknowledging or outwardly displaying the fact that you dislike capitalism. But first of all, this general rejection of capitalism is often used simply for the sake of social capital, in a form of what we call communitative capitalism, where we simply condemn generally morally unjust systems like capitalism or racism or sexism in hopes of simply gaining that social credit for people knowing that we're, quote, woke, or that we know what we're talking about, or that we're informed. In actuality, this does nothing to change the system itself, but only allows us to pat ourselves on the back and to have other people think that we're good people. In addition, the university itself is meant to be a structure that pacifies revolutionary criticism, because colleges will literally assign you papers to discuss why capitalism is bad, while acknowledging that the university system itself is capitalist. Therefore, you only go as far as to present the criticism and not to actually change anything about the structure or ideology of universities, that your general resistance to the system is contained within the system itself, and as such is no longer revolutionary. The last link is that universities largely encourage individualism. From the moment you walk into a university campus, you are seen as an adult, an individual. You are granted the right to choose your own future, your major, your interests. But these are all to create yourself as not a university student that should have solidarity with other students, or a particular scholar that should have solidarity with other scholars, or even a future worker that should have solidarity with other future workers, but rather as a singular person whose only goal is to outcompete all the other students and seize the limited spots for top jobs or graduate schools for yourself. It encourages not a collective mindset, but an individualistic mindset which promotes the capitalist system. Lastly, we'll talk about the Foucault K. The Foucault K, I think, is the most complex K of any of the ones we have mentioned before, and certainly requires a bit more background knowledge about Foucault. Unfortunately, we will not be able to go too in-depth in this general topic analysis, but I would encourage anyone trying to read this K to immerse yourselves in the literature generally, so you can more fully understand the arguments before we talk about the specific links. The general thesis of Foucault as we will discuss relevant to this topic, will sort of be divided into three parts. The first is this concept of knowledge power. Foucault and other authors like him forwarded this idea that society is controlled by those who have access to the technology of bureaucracy or the technocracy generally. What does this mean? Well, in our society, we are regulated by a literal bureaucracy, which is to say, a system of checks and balances built into the government that is meant to be able to distinguish and regulate the broad citizenry. However, if you have ever had trouble going to the DMV or going to get your passport renewed, you would know that the bureaucracy is incredibly inaccessible to the common person. It is difficult to figure out where to go, what lines to wait in, everything is inefficient, and it is difficult to know who to even speak to get a problem resolved. This, many people would say, is simply the case of a large government trying to govern a large amount of people. Foucault would say this is deliberate. The government creates a bureaucratic system that is deliberately difficult to engage in order to retain a physical sense of power in which the knowledge of how to function inside the government is literally a form of power, that the common person is separated from the government official because the government official is able to actually manipulate the government system and understand how it works, whereas the ordinary person would not be able to use those same government systems for their own benefit, locking them out of the general bureaucracy and giving them less political power than they normally could. Secondarily, there's also the idea of the technocracy, the idea by which scientists and general professionals create a different tier of understanding that we do not have access to, that you are sort of forced to rely on your doctor if they tell you there is something wrong with you because you simply don't know any better. What allows this generation of technocracy? The university, of course, and that is a link we will discuss. The educational process is meant to provide credentials with technocratic experts, which is to say, the reason why you consider your doctor knows more about medicine than you is because they went to college to study medicine and you did not. This is not a general argument that no doctors have any idea what they are talking about. Foucault would certainly concede that there have been legitimate advancements in scientific and medical technology writ large. His argument is simply that society is built in a way that assigns unnecessary credibility and gives these people more power than is necessarily needed. This leads to potential problems like in the medical-industrial complex, by which doctors might overprescribe medication, prescribe medication or procedures that may not even be necessary, but they do so, and we will simply pay for them or take them or have them by virtue of the fact that we trust doctors over everything else, given their technocratic value. The second argument is a general judgment of how society functions to create legality. It is called the panopticon, and it is the concept that the most insidious legal system is the one in which the laws are enforced by the individual upon themselves, and not by an external force like the government, which literally applies force or physical force to force you to conform to a law. The panopticon is the concept of an actual prison created by Jeremy Bentham, which would have a singular tower in the center, which is able to at all times gaze and illuminate any given prison cell encircling the tower, as pictured on the right. What makes this potential metaphor or prison structure hypothetically startling is the concept that at no point is everyone in the main warden's tower actually observing every cell. Rather, every cell is going to be regulating itself, because all the prisoners inside the cell know that at any point the tower could potentially be watching them. As such, instead of being forced to conform to the law by having a warden walk by and rattle on the bars, you simply conform to the rules of the prison on your own because you are afraid that at any point the warden might be looking. Foucault analogizes this general metaphor to society itself, which is to say that the way in which a lot of society's laws work now, the reason why many people refuse to jaywalk even when there are no police around, or refuse to speed even though they're on an open road, is that we tend to enforce laws upon ourselves by fear of government surveillance, by fear that we will be held accountable, and by fear that we will be watched. We will discuss how the university perpetuates this general fear of legality that leads to self-regulation. Finally, Foucault was very concerned with the categorization of individuals. Once society determines your identity, they can decide whether or not it ought to be regulated or changed. Foucault initially conceived of this in the concept of the medical gaze, in his book which detailed the way in which the medical complex has grown since the beginning of history. His argument being that doctors view patients through what is known as a medical gaze, by which they view them as people who need to be cured and somehow changed. Whereas in the early period of the Enlightenment, the sort of 1800s, people who actually had mental disorders were not considered dangerous, crazy, or unusual, but rather were respected as people who took a different view of the world. It was only till the 20th century, perhaps early 19th century, that doctors began to label people with these mental disorders as being dangerous, different, and in need of curing. This medical gaze then created the category of identity of crazy and non-crazy, and decided to then use these identities to discriminate against people it determined to be abnormal. As such, universities will also follow this general gaze in categorizing students through processes like the SAT, and we will discuss this more in the links section. The general Foucauldian links first is that the university will indoctrinate students into the beliefs discussed in the previous slide. It teaches students to generally bow to legal authority. Your teacher is the stand-in for the judge that will always determine whether or not your work is on time, what rules you must abide by, and be able to punish you just like a judge would by harming your grade, ergo the reason why you're in college. This causes you to internalize the subtle mechanisms of government control that you wouldn't normally think about, and self-apply your own rule of law. The university is essentially a replication of the panopticon, a system in which the singular teacher surveys the room full of students, determining whether they are cheating, determining whether their knowledge is congruous with the general knowledge of the university, and any deviation outside those established rules and modes of thought are punished with a drop in grades or potential expulsion from the university entirely. Universities secondarily perpetuate a system of knowledge power. They are the singular institution which allows the technocracy to thrive. The reason why doctors and scientists have gained legitimacy is because they have done so through their involvement in the college process. As such, the undue power given to physicians, given to scientists, given to politicians is all gained from the signaling which is adopted from having some sort of medical, scientific, or otherwise political degree. Universities also cause us to idolize these people. They tell us that the only way we will know what we are talking about is if we attend universities, attend the same courses they did, and practice in the same way they did, pass their examinations, and generally end up just like them. Any other alternative form of knowledge, the sort of urban intellectual which reads on their own, or whose knowledge is generated from life experience, is shunned in favor of the academic intellectual, whose knowledge is derived entirely from the reading of vetted academic books, or the general knowledge inculcated from the university system, not from experience writ large. Finally, we can consider the concept of the educational gaze, or of general categorization, as being one of the most problematic concepts of university. The universities are very considered with categorizing specific students by their interests or their use. This student is low income. This student is a scientist. This student is a first-generation student. This educational gaze allows the university to categorize students, potentially appeal to certain students, and control the path that students go along. If you are determined to be an economics major, you are given a particular path that you are diverted to, a particular set of classes and courses which you are required to take, and whose general outcome will determine your future as that same major, or as that in the profession that major governs. So generally, the educational gaze will be focused most heavily on people who don't conform to the regular norms of university or education. These people are most in danger because their subversive thoughts are generally not allowed within the university, and though universities have gotten less punitive throughout the course of society, they certainly do deter thinking that is considered inappropriate for the given course itself. And as such, this categorization is similar to the one that is often adopted in society between criminal and non-criminal, between subversive and non-subversive thinker, which allows the government to identify certain people and then regulate them for more particular control in the same way that the university does. Thank you for listening to this topic analysis about the new September-October topic for 2019. We'll be putting up resources for those of you who are part of the DebateDrills program that will outline more particular links and evidence for each one of these positions. Overall, thank you for listening, and we hope you have fun with this new topic.